You stand at the threshold. As the oil lamp falters, its flame trembling like it knows what's coming. Your newborn's breathing fills the room thin, damp, uncertain life, still learning how to exist. Outside, footsteps gather, not hurried, not cruel, just inevitable. A voice clears its throat. A stranger announces that the child must be examined. The blanket is drawn back, cold air finds bare skin. The infant startles, calloused hands weathered by years, ungentle by design, lift the child toward the light, turning flesh and bone as one might assess a flaw in stone. Instinct screams for you to pull your baby close, to shield it with your body. But you do not move. Here, even love is trained into silence. Below the city, the river flows without pause. The mountains remain unmoved, and on the shadowed slopes of Mount Taygetus, the wind carries no memory of the name you whispered, believing it might be enough. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Every time I make one of these, it still amazes me how history travels farther than any army ever did. Sparta sits in Laconia, a hard place in southern Greece, where the Eurotas River cuts through a plain and Mount Taygetus rises behind it, like a wall. Mount Taygetus. Image on the 15th of May 2019.jpg. The Sparta most people picture belongs to the long classical age, an era of rival city-states, war leagues, and propaganda that moved as fast as rumor. And that last part matters, because Sparta rarely speaks in its own voice. Much of what we think we know comes through outsiders, especially Plutarch, a Greek author writing centuries later under the Roman Empire, collecting traditions that were already half legend by the time he wrote them. Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus. So this story has a built-in tension. We are looking at Sparta through a glass that bends, but even through that distortion, a shape keeps reappearing, too consistent to be dismissed. A society that treated people as inventory. A city that feared weakness the way other places fear plague. A machine that didn't just train warriors, it tried to design them, starting in the most intimate place of all, human reproduction. And here is the paradox that drives everything that follows. Sparta built its fame on strength, yet the very methods that produced that strength also narrowed its future. It created perfect warriors, and in the same motion, it began to destroy the conditions that allow a society to survive. The first human anchor of this story is not a king. It is a Spartan mother. Call her Gorgo, not the famous queen, just a common name, a common life. A woman whose body belongs to herself in the way a shield belongs to the soldier carrying it, only until the city asks for it back. She has given birth before. She knows the ritual. She also knows the lie people tell outsiders. That Spartan women were free, that they were respected, that they were powerful. There is truth in that, and also a trap. Gorgo has been trained since girlhood to run, to wrestle, to sing in choruses that praise endurance. The city says this strength honors her, but in the privacy of her bones, she knows why it truly matters. A strong woman is not merely admired in Sparta. She is useful, she is capacity, she is production. Plutarch tells us that Lycurgus began at the source by regulating marriage and reproduction, treating the creation of children as a public concern, not a private one. Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus. That single phrase, began at the source, is a door into the Spartan mind. It means the city looked at its future the way a general looks at supply lines. It asked not only, how do we train men, but how do we produce the kind of bodies worth training? So the first curiosity spike hits before the baby even opens its eyes. What happens to love when a state treats reproduction as logistics? In Sparta, marriage can become less like a vow and more like an assignment. The pairing of bodies becomes a calculation. Even intimacy becomes civic labor. Plutarch describes a practice where an older man with a younger wife might introduce a younger, admired man to her so the household could produce children from good qualities. Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus. It is written as practicality, as wisdom, as the suppression of selfishness for the public good. But in the silence between those words is a missing voice. The woman's Gorgo's marriage was arranged with smiles and speeches about duty. Her husband is not cruel. He is simply Spartan. He lives in communal barracks for years. He visits at night, briefly, like a man checking a lamp before returning to the watch. When he touches her, it is not necessarily violence. It is emptiness, an act performed under a larger shadow. And then, when her child is born, Sparta comes to collect its inspection. Plutarch describes infants being examined, and those deemed unfit being exposed, left to die, traditionally associated with the slopes of Tacitus, Plutarch, Life of Lycurgus. But modern archaeology complicates the popular image of newborns thrown into a chasm. Excavations and reporting have noted that the expected infant remains have not been found in the way the myth would suggest, which has led scholars and journalists to question the literal cliff story as commonly told ABC News. That doesn't make the story safer, it makes it sharper, because even if the cinematic detail is exaggerated, the moral infrastructure is still there. A society that normalized the idea that some babies should not live for the sake of the city's health. So the elders come. They are not doctors. They are men of status, men of age, men who carry authority the way they carry scars. The baby is held up toward lamplight. Fingers press the tiny chest. The cry is judged. The limbs are turned. Gorgo does not beg, not because she does not love, but because she knows begging is a language Sparta punishes. If she breaks, she does not save her child. She only proves herself unworthy of raising a Spartan. In that moment, the city's true genius becomes visible. It trains people to police their own emotions. It turns the most natural human instinct to protect your child into something suspicious. If the baby passes, it is returned. But even then, the child is not safe. It is merely approved for the next stage of processing. And this is where we meet the second human anchor, a helot family. Call them Myron and Thaleia, with a young daughter Nisa and a son barely old enough to hold a reed whistle. They live outside the citizen core, on land that is not theirs. Their labor belongs to a Spartan household. Their harvest is measured before it is eaten. Their bodies are counted not as citizens, but as risk. Sparta's system depends on them, and that dependence terrifies Sparta, because when a ruling class is small and the labor class is large, the mathematics of fear is always present. Sparta can win wars and still die from the inside. A revolt does not have to be successful to be catastrophic. It only has to be big enough, bloody enough, to cost Sparta the one thing it cannot easily replace: citizens. So Sparta responds the way a besieged mind responds. It makes control into culture. It doesn't just fight enemies, it prevents them from existing. Myron teaches his children the rules that keep them alive. Don't look too proud, don't walk too straight, don't gather in groups at night, don't speak the wrong name too loudly. And then he teaches them the rule beneath all rules. If the shadows move, be smaller than the shadows. Because in the countryside, there is a story helots tell each other with their mouths barely moving. A story about boys, Spartan boys, who were trained to hunt them, the cryptia. Ancient sources and later tradition describe the cryptia as a harsh institution tied to stealth, hardship, and violence against helots. One of the most chilling details preserved in later summaries is the idea that Spartan ephors ritually declared war on the helots, so killings would not count as murder in a religious or legal sense. Britannica. Helot. Think about what that means for Myron. A government declares war on him without him lifting a weapon. It turns his existence into a legal enemy status. It makes his death administratively clean. This is the second curiosity spike sharpened to a blade. What if Sparta's perfect warrior was engineered less for foreign battle and more for domestic terror? Now return to Gorgo's child, growing under a sky that looks peaceful only to people who don't understand what the mountain is for. At 7 years old, the boy is taken into the Agoge. We can't name him because Sparta doesn't care about names the way other societies do. Sparta cares about function. But we can follow him. We can watch the city reach into the household and pull him out as if extracting a tooth. Gorgo dresses him without trembling hands. She fixes his hair. She tells him nothing comforting, because comfort is the first thing the Agoge tries to burn out. And when she walks him to the gathering place, she keeps her face still, not because she is made of stone, because she has been taught that a mother's tears are contagious. A boy who sees his mother cry learns the dangerous idea that grief is allowed, and Sparta cannot afford allowed grief. Not when it needs men who will hold the line, even when their friends are screaming beside them. The Agoge begins with deprivation. Hunger becomes constant. The body starts to normalize it, which is part of the design. Cold becomes ordinary. The skin toughens, the senses sharpen, and then the city gives the boy an ethical puzzle disguised as a lesson. Steal to survive, but be punished if caught. Not punished for theft, punished for failure. This is how Sparta builds the internal logic that later makes the cryptia possible. It teaches boys that the moral crime is not wrongdoing. The moral crime is incompetence. He learns to move quietly. He learns to watch adults without being seen. He learns to hide food. He learns to lie with a straight face. He learns, most of all, that the state is always watching and that the smallest weakness will be found. Older boys become predators and supervisors, not random bullies' tools. The younger learn to endure humiliation without flinching. They learn to answer questions quickly, briefly, sharply. Sparta's famous laconic speech becomes less a cultural quirk and more a survival tactic. The mind is trained to be short because fear is trained to be silent, and every so often, Sparta raises the temperature of the furnace. A ritual, a test, a public demonstration that the city can force pain into a child and still demand gratitude for the privilege. Even if some details have been embellished over time, the pattern is clear. Endurance becomes worship. Pain becomes proof. And while the boy is being reshaped, Gorgo is being reshaped too. She doesn't stop being a mother. She is simply forced to mother in a way that serves Sparta. Her pride becomes her permitted emotion. She is allowed to be proud of his hardness. She is allowed to be proud of his silence. She is allowed to be proud that he can be hungry without complaining. Her love is permitted only in the form that strengthens the city. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Myron's family is living through the other half of the Spartan machine, because the agoge does not exist in a vacuum. It exists because Sparta's social structure requires constant control. The citizen elite, small, intensely trained, rests on a massive foundation of coerced labor. That foundation remembers it was once free. That memory is dangerous. So fear becomes policy, and policy becomes ritual. Britannica notes that the ephors were said to declare war on helots each year, an act that, if accepted, frames murder as something that can be done without pollution, without legal consequence. Britannica helot. For Myron, that means every year begins with an invisible announcement: you are prey again. His daughter Nisa grows old enough to understand why her mother flinches at footsteps. His son learns to stop singing when he hears dogs bark in a certain pattern. Myron sees the irony with a clarity that burns. Sparta's warriors are celebrated across Greece as defenders of civilization. But the terror that keeps Sparta stable is aimed not outward, aimed inward, at the people who feed them. And then comes the third curiosity spike, the one that seals Sparta's fate. How do you maintain perfection when your citizen body is too small to replace itself? Sparta's system is elite by design, but elite systems have a hidden cost: scarcity. Every Spartan citizen lost in war is not just a casualty. He is a demographic wound, a lost investment of decades. A missing link in a chain Sparta believes must remain pure and strong. Other city-states can expand, adapt, recruit, naturalize. Sparta's identity is narrower. Its definition of Spartan is stricter. Its machine is expensive. So over generations, the same forces that created legendary soldiers also squeeze the citizen class tighter. A narrow pipeline, a limited pool, a brittle structure. For a time, reputation covers the weakness. Sparta's name becomes deterrence. Allies lean on it, enemies fear it. But history has a way of testing myths. In 371 BC, at the Battle of Leuctra, Thebes under Epaminondas breaks Spartan dominance with a tactical innovation, concentrating force in a deepened wing rather than spreading evenly across the line. Britannica, Battle of Leuctra. The significance isn't just military, it's symbolic. Sparta is defeated not by greater toughness, but by greater adaptability. The Spartan system is revealed. It produces men who can endure anything, but it struggles to produce enough flexibility to meet a changing world at the same pace. The machine can create blades. It is less skilled at creating minds that can redesign the battlefield. After Leuctra, the myth bleeds. The political order shifts. Sparta's grip on its world loosens. And when the grip loosens, the thing it fears most, internal collapse, moves closer. What happens to Myron's family in this era is not cleanly recorded. Sparta's victims rarely get archives, but we can trace the human consequence. When a state built on coercion loses its ability to intimidate, the old violence doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes desperate. It becomes uglier. And Gorgo, now older, watches her son return not as the boy she raised, but as the man the city manufactured. He stands straighter. He speaks less. He has learned to treat pain as background noise. He has learned to treat human beings as categories: citizen helot, enemy, asset. He may love his mother, but his love has been trained to stay behind his eyes. This is the psychological aftermath Sparta rarely gets blamed for. Not just what it did to people it oppressed, but what it did to its own children. A society that burns away softness doesn't simply remove weakness. It removes a kind of flexibility the human spirit needs to remain human. And then time does what time always does. It turns monsters into stories. By the Roman era, Sparta survives as spectacle and idea more than a power. Travelers come to see Spartan customs. Writers describe rituals. People watch reenactments. The city that once engineered fear becomes a museum of its own legend. And that is where the story becomes almost unbearable in its irony. Sparta's brutality outlives Sparta's power. The machine that produced the perfect warrior becomes famous precisely because it was so extreme that later generations couldn't stop staring. They remembered, they repeated, they exaggerated, they doubted, they argued. They could not look away. Even the landscape seems to hold the echo. The mountain still dominates the horizon, Mount Taygetus image on the 15th of May 2019.jpg. The river still threads through the valley, Eurota's image. The ruins still catch the light where crowds once cheered and boys once learned to stop crying, ancient theater of Sparta image. And somewhere between the myth and the evidence between Plutarch's traditions and archaeology's silence, there is still a truth that lands like a stone in the stomach. Sparta tried to turn human life into policy. It treated reproduction as strategy. It treated childhood as raw material. It treated an entire population as an internal enemy that could be legally hunted Britannica Helot. In the end, it succeeded in forging a reputation for perfection. And then it discovered the price of perfection is fragility. Because a society is not only a shield wall, it is also births and harvests, and laughter and improvisation and forgiveness. Things you cannot train into a child by starving him, and cannot preserve in a state by declaring war on the people who feed it. Sparta built warriors strong enough to hold a line. But the line it could not hold was time. And that is the haunting image to leave you with. A mother standing still as her son is taken. A helot father listening to footsteps in the dark. And a mountain watching over both silent, unchanged, indifferent. The perfect warrior was never the end of the story. He was the warning.